Hello everyone, welcome to Human Genetics. In this chapter 2, we are going to dive into the cell. We will define what a cell is. We will look into the structures that make up the cell and the functions of the different components that are found in the cell and that make up the cell. Then we are going to take a look at cell division, and eventually we are going to conclude this chapter with more of a microscopic look at the cell. We're going to take a look at microbiomes. Without further ado, let's address the first segment of this chapter, which is defining the cell. 1. 2. What are the structures that make up the cell, and what are the functions of these different structures? Now, what are cells? Cells are defined as the basic units of life. Now, the basic unit of life means that these are the smallest components in a living system that are going to carry all the properties that define life. For instance, living systems have to be able to reproduce. The cell is the smallest thing in a body, in a living system that can reproduce. Living cells have to be able to use energy. They have to be able to adapt. They have to be able to evolve, right? They have to be able to respond to their environment. Well, cells are able to do all of that. Smaller than cells, we don't see these characteristics. Specifically, proteins, right? Carbohydrates, the molecules on their own do not have these characteristics that cells have. So, very important, remember that cells are the basic unit of life. In the body, we have a lot of cells. We have trillions of cells, right? Some of the cells are specialized cells. Some cells are stem cells. And when we talk about specialized cells, we talk about cells that are differentiated. In other words, when you consider, for instance, skin cells, liver cells, nerve cells, epithelial cells, these cells are all different, right? They are specialized. So we have more than 290 different types of specialized cells. These cells, most of the time, are going to exist together in an aggregate. As the cells come together, similar cells working toward the same function, they end up forming what we call tissues. There are 4 major types of tissues, including epithelial tissues, connective tissues, nervous tissues, and muscle tissues. Now, epithelial tissues are found covering surfaces, while connective tissues, they behave like glue. They are bringing 2 different tissues together with some kind of form of glue. If you consider, for instance, your skin is made up of epithelial tissues and some nervous tissue in your skin. You're going to find between the nervous tissue and epithelial tissues, the connective tissues that are bringing them together, right? The connective tissue in the skin are the tissues in which the blood vessels are running, right? This is just to illustrate the role of the connective tissues. The nervous tissues are going to conduct the information so that the body can realize what is happening around it, right? And also how to respond to environmental stimuli. The muscles are going to be essential for movement. But beyond movement, they are also going to be very important in body temperature. But let me close that parenthesis. Now, cells share a lot in common because they carry all the characteristics of life, right? One can wonder, okay, well, what caused them to have these different characteristics of life? But that's another story, right? We can ask the following question. As we have different tissues made up with specialized cells, for instance, epithelial cells are not the same cells that you're going to find in connective tissues, that are not the same kind of cells you will find in nervous tissue, that are not the same cells that you will find in muscle tissue. Now, here is the thing. When you consider yourself as an individual, all your cells, regardless of what they are, in your body contain the exact same genetic information. Yet, a nerve cell doesn't look like a muscle cell. They don't perform the same function. Question though, how is it possible that in your body, nerve cells and muscle cells that contain the exact same genetic information do not look alike and do not do the same job? The answer to that is that every single specialized cell or differentiated cell is expressing a set of genes that another cell is not expressing. For instance, the set of genes that cause muscle cells to be muscle cells are not expressed in the nervous tissue, so that this nervous tissue obviously is not going to be like the muscle cells. They're not going to look alike. They're not going to perform the same function. So the set of genes that are being expressed and genes that are being turned off determine the specialization of a particular cell. In other words, the proteins that are produced in muscle cells are different from the proteins that are produced in nerve cells, that are different from the proteins that are produced in connective cells. Now, let's face this. We have to obviously say, yes, you have different sets of proteins, but if they have the same exact genetic information, should they not be expressing some level of similarity in terms of gene expression and proteins? Now we are going to talk about what we call housekeeping genes that are expressed in all cells, regardless if that cell is a epithelial cell, a connective cell, tissue cell, a nervous tissue cell, a muscle cell. These housekeeping genes are expressed in all the cells. However, the regulator genes that are not housekeeping, right? Those regulator genes are the ones that are going to set the difference between when a cell becomes a muscle cell, a nerve cell, a epithelial cell, and so on. So, what is the job of connective tissues? Well, the connective tissues are going to find protecting organs. They're going to provide support. Think of the bones. Because of the bones, your brain is protected in the skull, right? Some of them are going to bind cells together, right? So that you can have a matrix on which cells are attaching, right? The connective tissues are found throughout the body, filling up spaces, right? And in this connective tissue, we're going to have different kind of connective tissues, including the cartilage that is solid but flexible, bones that are solid and hard. I mean, in terms of hard, meaning that they are not flexible so they can break, right? The blood is fluid and the fat is not fluid, it's solid. Not solid in the sense that, it cannot change shape. No. Then we have epithelial tissues. These epithelial tissues are going to allow to actually contain fluid. Think, for instance, of your bladder. Your bladder is going to contain the urine, right? That urine to stay in there means that the epithelial cells have to be tightly packed together, right? When you consider the digestive tract is going to contain some fluid, right? Now let's move on muscles. Muscles, they contract, they provide some movement. Nervous tissue, as I already mentioned, it gathers some information, transmits that information, and allows the body to respond to environmental stimuli. With that being said, let's take a look at the different kind of cells. In the body, we do have two major types of cells. The somatic cells, which are the cells of the body. These cells contain two genomes. If you consider your skin cells are going to contain the genome you receive from mom and the genome you receive from dad. That makes it two genomes. These cells are diploid. These cells are diploid. Now, the second type of cells are gametes or sex cells. These gametes or sex cells are reproductive cells. These reproductive cells are sperm cells and egg cells. These cells contain half the amount of genetic information that somatic cells contain, right? They are going to be haploid that way. So while somatic cells contain a number of chromosomes that we consider 2n, the haploid cells, the gamete cells, or reproductive cells, they contain n chromosomes. So 2n chromosomes. While the haploid cell, they contain n chromosomes. Now, in a human, n equals 23, 2n equals 46 chromosomes, right? Now, the gametes, sperm and egg, are going to come together through the process of fertilization to produce a brand new individual, right? That fertilization is going to restore the 46 chromosomes, right? A sperm brings 23 chromosomes, an egg brings 23 chromosomes together. They're going to form 46 chromosomes so that you can exist, right? Now, at the very beginning, after fertilization, we have a zygote. When the zygote starts multiplying, the cells that are now diploid are going to become stem cells. And the stem cells have the power to differentiate into many, many kind of cells. All the cells that we have in our body come from that original cell that is a zygote that eventually is going to split into two cells. Two cells are going to split into 4 cells and 4 into 8 cells. We are not going to dive into the development here, but these initial cells are blank cells. They can become literally any cell the body needs. These are stem cells. Now, these stem cells are going to differentiate. Now, as we consider the cells and we look into the structure and makeup and behavior of the cell, we notice that across all living systems, the cells are going to fall into really three domains. These three domains are going to be the domain of archaea, which are very primitive cells that live in extreme environments such as hydrothermal vents, such as extreme cold, extreme heat, extreme pressures, and so on. Then we have the bacteria that are around us, right? And then you have eukarya. The eukarya are eukaryotic cells. These eukaryotic cells are characterized by the fact that they're going to have a nucleus, right? Now, let's digress a little bit and go back to archaea and bacteria. Archaea and bacteria, they used to be classified as one single group, the group of prokaryotes. These cells are characterized by the fact that they are very simple, their genetic information is not enclosed in an envelope, and they don't have membrane-bound organelles. They are unicellular organisms. In other words, one single cell is an organism, right? On the other hand, when we look at eukarya, the domain of eukarya, this is where we're going to find organisms with complex cells, cells with a nucleus. That nucleus is basically an envelope that surrounds some genetic information. And beyond that envelope that surrounds some genetic information, you're going to have a whole host of membrane-bound organelles that are themselves enclosed in one huge envelope that we call the plasma membrane. We are going to address this. But I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of idea of what a eukaryotic cell is. And when we look at eukarya, organisms in eukarya occur in two forms. We have unicellular eukaryotic organisms such as yeast, protist, right, to mention only these two. And then you have multicellular eukaryotic organisms such as you, a dog, a cat, a tree, right? Now, all the cells, whether you are an archaea, bacteria, or eukarya, you belong to any of these domains, they're going to be made up of a minimum of structures. That minimum of structures include the plasma membrane that sets up the limit of the cell, the cytoplasm, that is a semi-fluid substance where reactions are going to occur inside of the cell, DNA, regardless of if one cell is a prokaryotic cell or eukaryotic cell, they are all made up of DNA as the molecule that contains the genetic information. And finally, all the cells have ribosomes. The ribosomes are the structures in the cells that are responsible for the existence of proteins. Without ribosomes, forget about protein synthesis, right? So, when we consider living organisms such as human, we are eukaryotic organisms. You know that. I know that you know that. All right. So what are the chemical compounds that are found making up the cell? You have four major chemical compounds that make up the cell. You are going to have the carbohydrates or sugars. Some of the sugars that I'm pretty sure you are familiar with are glucose, galactose, lactose, starch, glycogen, okay, cellulose, to name only this. In addition to carbohydrates, we have lipids. Among the lipids, we have fats that are in general not very soluble at room temperature. And we also have oils that are typically soluble at room temperature. Then we have proteins. In the group of proteins, we are going to have proteins that are structural and proteins that are functional, right? If you consider, for instance, your hair is made up of proteins. But then the enzyme that catalyze chemical reactions in your body, right? We don't necessarily find them making up the structure of your cells, but they are very instrumental in causing changes to occur in your body. Then we have nucleic acids. The nucleic acids include DNA, which is the molecule that contains the genetic information, and RNA, which is the molecule that is going to contain a version of the information that is compatible with the existence of proteins. We are going to address this when we look at gene expression, right? The carbohydrates, again, they are source of energy, and some of them play a role of structure. For instance, cellulose is responsible for the development of a cell wall in plants, right? Without cellulose, plants do not have a cell wall, right? The lipids are going to be the source of hormones. They are very important for the development of membranes. When you consider, for instance, the plasma membrane, we're going to see this a little later today. The lipids are essential for insulation and also can be used as source of energy in terms of long-term source of energy. The proteins, they have many functions. I told you that some of them are structural proteins. Others are going to be functional proteins. What I did not say is that the proteins are essential for the movement, right? When you consider muscle cells are able to cause movements because of the proteins, in addition to obviously the energy that comes from the carbohydrates, right? That is converted into ATP. We're going to see that a little later. So proteins are also essential to allow the blood to clot. Okay, very important for the development of connective tissues. So these proteins act as glue, right, to bring cells together. Enzymes obviously are important in catalyzing chemical reactions, right? While the nucleic acid is going to contain the genetic information, I already mentioned that.